Thanks everyone for coming out to hear me talk about this title, which is Driving Sourcing Initiatives Through Shared Savings Goals. Zycus actually helped me come up with that title. I think they just grabbed a handful of buzzwords out of a hat and threw them at the wall. That's what they came up with. So what we're really going to talk about is how Cubist, give a little bit of context on Cubist Pharmaceuticals, talk about how we go through the savings forecast process, and then tracking and reporting those savings, what the results have been to date. That works for everyone. And feel free, like Jim mentioned, feel free to ask questions throughout. I'm not going to hold time till the very end for Q&A, so just put your hand up and you can talk. You can ask questions throughout. So there are some forward-looking statements in here about future revenues and operating income. Disclaimer, I'm sure you've seen that before. So we're going to provide you a brief overview, Cubist, introduce our sourcing savings forecasting process, present the methodology about how that savings is tracked and forecast, and then share some of those results. Cubist's, well, actually first, how many of you folks are actively involved in tracking and negotiating, tracking, and reporting savings? Okay, good. Makes sense for this type of topic. But just wanted to make sure. Cubist Pharmaceuticals, our organization is about 20 years old, founded in Lexington, Massachusetts. Currently have 900 people, although we just completed an acquisition on Thursday, so now we're at 1,200 people. And we focus primarily on the acute care environment, mainly anti-infectives. So we have, I think, 5 of the 10 most recently filed anti-infectives on the market are from Cubist. Our big one is Cubicin, that provides the bulk of our revenue comes from Cubicin, which is a drug which you never want to take. It's if you've got a nasty staph infection, MRSA, intra-abdominal infections, that's when you'll end up taking Cubicin. So pretty bad, all distributed in the hospital environment. We've been recognized this year. We were number 6 on the Boston Globe's top place to work, number 1 for a biopharmaceutical. And as I mentioned there below, we recently announced the acquisition of Trius Therapeutics and Optimer Pharmaceuticals, both which help bolster our pipeline of anti-infectives. This is the last year, our CEO announced what he calls the building blocks of growth, and this is where we want to be in 2017. $2 billion in global revenue, it's about double what we are now. 4 product candidates in late-stage clinical trials, that's in addition to what we already have now in the pipeline. $700 million in non-GAAP adjusted operating income, and then just highly differentiated culture that we maintain backing that up. So the reason I share this slide is because strategic sourcing and savings really play a strong role in that orange block. Our CFO came to Mary Kaczynski, my boss, head of the senior director of strategic sourcing, and said, Mary, this is a lot of this orange block. You are the queen of orange. You own that. How do we get to $700 million in operating income? The reason that's critical is because $2 billion in global revenue, we can do that with 17% year-over-year increase in revenue. To get to $700 million, we have to actually increase operating income by 21%. So we need to do better than just improving revenue. We need to improve our operating margins as well. And that's where sourcing and any savings we can generate contributes straight to that $700 million. So first of all, I know everyone kind of understands cost avoidance, cost reduction, cost savings. In order to get to a place where we could even have a program, we had to define what savings means to Cubist and socialize that with senior leadership, get all the way up to the CEO and COO. They understand these terms when we tell them here's how we save money. Cost reduction is pretty basic. It's basically the last price paid versus new price. It's also, if you go out to a competitive bid for a brand new category, or brand new good or service, we take an average of those bids as long as there aren't any wild outliers, and we use that as our baseline to track cost reduction. Demand management is largely through looking at actually how much of a good or service is required and working to reduce that, but still get the same value out of that good or service. Process improvement is mostly FTE related, so an example would be we implemented a new temp staffing program that reduced the number of invoices processed by, I think we were doing about 3,000 invoices a year in temp staffing down to 1 a week through a managed staffing program, so all the savings associated with that reduced number of invoices processed would be considered process improvements. And then cost avoidance is really avoiding an increase in cost. So if a supplier comes to you and says, we're going to increase your fees by 5%, we get it to 2.5%. We still take credit for that 2.5%, which is treated the same as a cost reduction because, frankly, we would have been paying that additional fee of sourcing hadn't gotten involved. So this is actually where I think Cubist is somewhat unique. When we come up with oh, go ahead.
Sorry, you said to ask questions.
Yeah, go ahead.
Back to the definitions of cost savings. And it sounds like you went to a lot of your functional areas to help define and make sure you're all in alignment.
Mm-hmm.
Did you have any pushback?
Yeah, we definitely had pushback. It was less with the stakeholders and more with the finance folks, who the financial analysts who said, we want to measure you against budget. Well, we can't be there's only so much we can do in helping to establish what that budget is. So if you've budgeted wildly off what it should be, we're not going to take a penalty for the fact that we can't get you to where your budget should be. So we're not going to use budget as baseline, which is what the finance folks really work. The FP&A, financial planning and analysis, who support the business areas, that's kind of what they were driving at. So we got them really to a place where they realized, all right, sourcing savings may be different than savings or coming in under budget. Go ahead.
On the cost avoidance, how did you get finance to agree? Because there's nothing tangible about the higher costs that you did or were going to pay.
Yeah.
There's nothing that they can point to in receipts or anything that showed that this was what the price would have been, but we were able to avoid this.
Right. We got them involved early on in some individual sourcing exercises where a quote would come in from a supplier. We'd get them involved and say, hey, here's what the supplier's asking us to pay. Even sometimes that quote went into the budget for the next year, and then we went ahead and negotiated that. Even if we're paying a little more than we paid last year, they saw that we're paying less than what the quote came in or what the supplier was requesting. So they bought into the fact that there was some, serious negotiations that went on just to avoid a 5% increase, and instead we got down to a 2% or 1% or even flat fee. Similarly, another big cost avoidance that we take a lot, especially in the clinical research space, is avoidance of startup costs. So we start a new clinical trial, they come to us, say, here's your full budget baked in. These are the startup costs. We work with them to then get the CRO, clinical research organization, who wants the business to eat some of those startup costs in order to take on a $50 million trial.
Okay, thanks.
Did you have a question, sir?
Yeah, you track your cost savings year-over-year price changes. Do you also track year-over-year price increases?
Not really. So we track savings only on those initiatives that we get involved in. So if there was a cost increase on something that we didn't necessarily get involved in, we probably wouldn't go back and try and keep tabs on that. Most of our spend is on indirect. We have very little direct materials we use. We have no manufacturing base. We use CMOs, for all of our drug product. So there is some cost containment, some negotiation that goes on on the cost of drug to market, but really most of our negotiations are focused on the indirect space. Okay, so going back to, this is the forecasting process. So what we do, and we're actually going through it right now, is in October, we get a first look at the budgets for next year. So we sit with our FP&A colleague and senior leadership from that function. So for example, I support HR, regulatory affairs, and medical affairs. And I sit and I go through line by line what their budget looks like for next year and where I believe we can assist them in reducing that budget through a sourcing initiative. So it could be a brand new project that they're going to be kicking off and we're going to go through an RFP for them. It could be an existing vendor that just hasn't been renegotiated in 3 years and we want to take that on. Or it could be a spend leverage exercise where they've got 4 different suppliers. We want to take that out to bid and get it down to 1, 2 suppliers. So we go through line by line and we build out the spend and then similarly the savings that we anticipate for each line of the budget. We take that, we roll it all up, and we get our first pass at what we believe savings will be for next year. That's never what it ends up being, but what it is it's a starting point for us to then say, okay, for this year, we think that we've got $10 million in savings identified in actual projects that are going to occur according to the budget. So it's not, we think 3% of spend or pulling out a number over last year. It's actually, we're going through and tying them directly to line items. We then anticipate that 35 to 40% historically has come from unplanned projects, and we lump that in. And then we look at what we did last year. So we may have negotiated some projects. I'm negotiating projects right now in October. I don't get credit in 2014 for those projects because I've done them this year and we only take 12 months worth of savings. But I can take credit for what we call carryover savings, which basically means projects executed in the previous year where the savings is going to bleed into next year. So if I do something which has a monthly service fee right now in October, I only get 2 months of credit for 2013, and then the other 10 months goes towards 2014 carryover savings. So we add that into our overall savings goal, and we then report that to the CEO and CFO. They decide, yeah, that looks good, or no, that's not enough. You need to figure out, you need to find some more opportunities. We then go back to all of those senior stakeholders. So I'll go to the Senior VP of Medical Affairs and I'll say, I've identified $1 million worth of savings in your area across these 10 line items. She'll agree to that, or she'll say, well, if you also talk to this colleague, he's going to be kicking off a project. I noticed it's not in your plan. Or, well, you've got something on here that we've actually already, we're already sourcing, we're already done, there's not really anything you can do to help. But anyways, I get her buy-in and her commitment to that savings target for medical affairs. This happens across the organization, so every single functional stakeholder is aligned with a category leader who then we both have in our goals for next year that savings is going to be achieved. So the medical affairs VP is now incentivized that I have to make sure that my whole team is working with strategic sourcing to generate these savings, because if not, she's not going to hit any of her goals. And I don't know, I'm curious, does that go on in other areas where you have shared savings within your department? I'm just curious, raise your hands if that happens. One? Good for you. What we found is that really, by tying that into their goals, they are beating the drum, within their teams. You better be getting sourcing involved for every project that's over $100,000. That's sort of the minimum where sourcing will take a look at a project. Below that, we just don't have the bandwidth. We might help them on something that's critical, but for the most part, it's $100,000 per month. So this, and I threw this up here briefly, but this is basically what we end up with at the end of the budget planning cycle across every different department that we have within the company. And this year, I think we identified at our first pass 104 different projects that our team's going to be working on. Last year, we identified about 72, and we've ended up executing close to 140. So we know there's stuff that's not on here that we're going to end up working on. For example, with those 2 acquisitions, there's going to be synergy activities where we've got to look at their suppliers, compare them to our suppliers, figure out what to do, or we may have the same enterprise software license. We've got to figure out how to merge those. We don't really have any of that on here now, but we know it's going to happen, and that will contribute to that unplanned savings line that I mentioned. So tracking and reporting, this is where iSave comes in. We use iSave as, earlier when Mary went up and accepted the user adoption excellence award, right? It said, our team has 100% compliance with iSave. That's because they're not allowed to take credit for savings unless it's in iSave. So really there is no way, if they want to meet their goals for the year, they have to put it in iSave. It's a mandate, but part of being able to mandate that is that we've made the tool very friendly to use, and we get some really good data out of it. And we produce some good reports with it, so reports that they then go share with their functional stakeholders. So if they don't get it in iSave, they don't get credit. They also, they've got their stakeholders saying, I've got my goal, you've got to save me $1 million. What are you doing this year? Like, tell me how we're progressing. Some groups check in monthly. We try and convince them quarterly is okay, because we don't want to be running these reports more than quarterly, given that they are somewhat time consuming. But you've got the stakeholders really actively interested in what savings Sourcing is able to generate for them. So this is kind of the process we just do on a monthly basis internally to make sure our own, we're more on path. Extract a raw savings report data from iSave at the month end plus 3 days. Reports are prepared and validated with the sourcing team, so I pull that data and put some initial reports out that are rolled up to the category level and the department level. We then prepare what we call the thermometer slides. I'll show you those in a second. And then the sourcing leaders go out and share those reports. They have sit-down sessions with each of the department heads that have that goal. Then, about 15 days later, all of those department heads are meeting in what's called the business operations team meeting. And this slide is presented that shows how we're doing as a company against our sourcing initiative. So it's a roll-up aggregate of all of those individual reports. And the reason we share with the functional leaders before we share in that team meeting is you've got all the most senior folks in the company in that meeting. We don't want one of them not understanding where their savings numbers came from. They need to absolutely buy in before they get into that meeting that that number is real. They understand what projects it came from. They understand that if they're below the threshold, they know what's going to be done to meet that goal. Because if not, I can guarantee our COO is going to question them and say, you're 50% under target right now, what's going on? This is our thermometer slide. Basically, this is what they get on a quarterly basis. It just shows how they're tracking towards forecast savings. So we track 2 different stages of savings. One is forecast, what we call negotiated, meaning the deal's been done and we believe by the end of the year we're going to save $1 million. Realized savings is that spend has actually occurred and we have saved the money. And the reason we track both those is there's nothing worse than having a negotiations close. You say to your stakeholder, hey, we're going to save you $1 million on this project. Then they don't spend the money, and or the program's cut in half. And 5 months later, you're going to them and saying, hey, we saved you that $1 million, remember? And they're saying, you didn't save me that because we didn't spend the money to the degree we thought you were going to. Similarly, we want to take credit if we negotiate on something that's like, let's say, an hourly rate for an IT consultant. And we forecast it based on 1,000 hours. If they go spend 2,000 hours to do the project, we're going to take credit across all 2,000 of those hours on that hourly rate. So it can go both ways. And we just want those numbers to be as real as possible at the end of the year. So what you'll see is forecast savings is sort of like, if we stopped working today and strategic sourcing didn't do another deal, that's where we'd be at the end of the year. Realized savings is as we keep track up against that, and at the end of the year, they should basically meet, because our forecast will change depending on how projects are actually going. So the thermometer slide is something they like to see because they want to know how am I doing against my goal. They want that purple bar to be as close to the top as possible. A couple other key data points on here. These are just the top initiatives that are contributing to their savings, to their associated savings. That up on the left there is or on your right is the initiatives that are currently in process. So you kind of pick the top ones and how you're doing against them. They wouldn't be showing up in this thermometer yet or in the savings yet because they're not done yet. And then the bottom there is any open issues. So if you've got a team project manager who's not willing to get you involved, or if you've got a project that is delayed by 6 months, so you're only going to get to take credit for 6 months of savings this year, that's where that lives. So we produce this for each functional department on a quarterly basis. That's how they keep abreast of what's going on in their area with regards to sourcing savings. It's, this isn't like rocket science, it's just something they've gotten used to. I'd love it if we had iSave to a point where this could be real time, we could extract it, it was always on someone's dashboard, they could check it anytime, but realistically, because there is some manual pulling of reports and generating this information, quarterly is good enough for most leadership.
How do you track the realized savings?
So for some things it's easy, like capital equipment purchase, pretty much realized equals negotiated because they happen within the same time frame. For some things like the temp staffing project we have to on a monthly basis or quarterly basis go back, pull invoice data, pull data from the suppliers. A lot of times, if it's big enough, we just get the suppliers to supply, to give us whatever key variables are going into our savings calculation. So whether it's hours worked, widgets consumed, or widgets purchased. If it's related to the clinical trial, which a lot of our savings are related to clinical trials, we typically just check in on when those milestone payments are released, because a lot of our payments with regards to clinical trials are, the first patient into the trial, they get 20%. Last patient out of the trial, they get 20%. So you want to just make sure that that money is being spent and that big changes haven't occurred during the last time since it was negotiated that have wiped out or increased some of that savings. So we spend a lot of time keeping up with the realized savings. I know not every organization does that, but it gives, I think, credibility to senior leadership that they actually see that. So just some high-level results. I think what's important, we built this slide initially 2 years ago when Mary started, kind of kicked off the strategic sourcing team and was brought in. And this was going to be the different waves that we were going to focus on. Because we've had success and we've got such buy-in, we've actually moved international, legal, scientific agencies, and clinical studies kind of up into wave 2. We've been able to more aggressively pursue some of these opportunities than we originally thought we were going to be able to, because we've proved that the team is delivering value, and it's enabled us to hire additional people for her team, because folks in clinical and in legal, the senior execs were saying, well, strategic sourcing is not supporting us because they don't have enough people. How do we, get involved?
How did you decide what was going to be in wave 1?
I think, this was previous to my time, but my understanding is they basically, on this grid, you've got speed of implementation versus potential savings and impact. So things that were higher impact or savings and lower on speed of implementation, they took on first. Contract labor, it was a pain to implement, but it did have a pretty high impact. And also, this was one of those ones where it delivered a lot beyond the savings because it just simplified the process so much for all of the end users who were previously managing getting calls from temp staffing agencies constantly, managing a different PO for every single temp staff they had in their department, managing rates that varied from a 40% markup to 110% markup. So we put that in place even if, as a wave one priority, even if it was more difficult than others to implement.
Why was it so hard to implement?
Sorry, why was that? Because we had,
Yeah.
so we had, I think I said 85 to 90 different suppliers that we had to figure out how to get all to go through one managed staffing provider. Not all of them wanted to do that. We had a process that was based on one PO per temp, and instead we decided, all right, we're going to have one blanket PO for all of our temp staffing spend. How are we still going to get the appropriate approvals, and what's the requisition process going to look like for each one of those temps? We just had a lot of integrations that needed to take place between the HR systems, IT systems, and this new managed staffing provider systems. We had to then train and communicate to the entire company who were used to doing things one way. And the good news was it ultimately was an easier process for them, but they weren't all right on board at the beginning. So, I mean, that I was the project manager on this implementation. It took us, it was supposed to take us 6 months, it ended up taking us 10 months to put in. But I think we got it right because we've been able to get some good savings out of it, plus just the whole process improvement and visibility into our temp staff. I mean, from a compliance perspective, no one had one view of how many temp staff we had in our organization at any given time, and now we do. Plus, we no longer have independent consultants posing as temp staff or temp staff posing as independent consultants. We used HR, their guidelines to make sure we don't run into co-employment risk. So there's a lot of wins on that project as well. And then just a couple other key bullet points. So year-over-year savings from 2012 to 2013 was a 117% increase. So more than double what our savings were from last year to this year. Next year, we don't think we're going to get that increase. It will probably be about flat compared to what it was this year. Number of projects went from 136 in 2012 to we're already at 200 plus this year that we've been involved with. As I mentioned before, we extended scope to new areas that we weren't going to previously work in, the main one being clinical operations, legal, international. And then we're now being called, so I know savings is critical, right? We couldn't exist without meeting our savings targets each year, but we've been able to now get more into other value-added activities that a strategic sourcing organization would typically be called on to work on. So supply chain risk, supplier performance management, compliance, especially around kind of with the Sunshine Act right now, there's a lot of regulations coming in around when we spend money with a healthcare provider. We have to be able to track and report all that. So we're working very closely with compliance to make sure all vendors or suppliers that are also healthcare providers are labeled as such, and that we're able to report on the money being spent with them.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
So how do you think in 2 years now that you've been running this, we talked about HighSave has taken more of that tactical role of, but you still have a lot of work to do. How has that helped with your resource time of moving away from tactical into more of your strategic?
Yeah, well, so previously, before HighSave, we had an Excel spreadsheet that just went out. Sent to all the teams, and put your projects in, aggregated all of that information, tried to pull it all together, went back out to them and said, where do you have, can you justify your realization and your negotiations? Save quotes all over the place, save, final negotiated contracts. It was just a mess to keep track of everything. And with HighSave now, we've got at least, the team knows this is where savings get entered. This is how they input their savings. This is where they put in, the quotes and historical spend to justify what is the baseline that they're tracking that savings against. So it's auditable. If FP&A wants to come look and justify some of our savings, they can go in and quickly see that. Plus, the reporting process is now just on a monthly basis. We run this one report. It spits out all the data, and then we manipulate it to get, run some pivot tables and get it to the point where it's all rolled up, negotiated, realized by department and by sourcing colleagues. So everyone knows, Matt Weinberg, I've generated 1.2 million. My peer is at this level, so you sort of keep track of both your own plus at the department level.
So would you say maybe 10% of what you would normally have done through that tactical and spreadsheets has been saved and realized?
From just a pure sourcing colleague, time,
Yeah.
it's probably cut our savings tracking and reporting time by 50% compared to what we were doing before. Now that's not the whole part of your job, so maybe it works out to just a couple percentage points in your overall time spent, but significant when it comes to, and the other thing is when people didn't know how it was going to take place or they didn't understand the process, a lot of times they just didn't do it. So we were missing out on tracking some savings that people achieved because they didn't know exactly how to report it and what backup documentation they needed to have. Yeah, and their opinion is I should be out negotiating new contracts rather than trying to keep track of my savings on stuff that's already been negotiated. But our opinion is we don't get buy-in from the business unless you report it accurately. So just a couple takeaways. For the savings program, you need a sustainable program with targets, and we really believe your targets should be built on actual budgets, actual line items within the budget, not just an overall 2% on spend or 3% on indirect spend. Savings definitions that are understood clearly by the business, and and having a user-friendly tool for tracking and reporting that can also be audited is, in our opinion, been critical to get the adoption that we have had. Similarly, you've got to socialize your program and make sure all levels of the organization understand it and buy into it. We were but we were fortunate in that we had a CEO and a CFO who understood strategic sourcing and what could be delivered through strategic sourcing. So when they hired Mary and agreed to put the program in place, they bought into this already, and they didn't know how it was going to transpire. They didn't know what numbers were going to come out of it, but they had seen in previous organizations the value of a strong sourcing organization with kind of critical talent as opposed to tactical buyers and one-off negotiations. And then we really believe strongly in the fact that you need to communicate those savings targets. And once you have the buy-in, communication is easier because those folks want to see how they're doing, how you're doing, how their organizations are doing on those numbers.